To do the back stitch, I'm going to bring my needle up through the back of the fabric, pulling the thread all the way through, and then coming over about 1/4 of an inch and putting my second stitch in. I'm going to move over another 1/4 of an inch, come back up through the back of the fabric, and back into that second hole that I created. I'm going to continue following this pattern, going in a straight line down my fabric, and I'm going to come back through the bottom just to get a little bit more practice. To create a running stitch, I'm going to come through the back of my fabric, pulling my thread all the way tight, moving over about 1/4 of an inch. I'll pull my thread all the way through again, come back another 1/4 of an inch over, and I'm going to keep following this pattern, moving out to the right. This is very similar to our back stitch, but instead of moving backwards, we're just going to keep heading in one direction, leaving gaps between each stitch. To create a straight stitch, we're essentially going to be using a series of running stitches placed in a proper order to create a decorative pattern. So I'm starting with a little 5-pointed star. I have my first stitch in, and now I'm going to start building out and creating those other points. There is no real right or wrong way to do a straight stitch, as long as you have it set up in such a way that we get a decorative pattern at the end. So there's my first little star, and now I'm going to be creating a little leaf pattern as well. To create a French knot, we're going to come up through the back of our fabric, pulling our thread all the way through, then placing our needle in front of that thread. I'm going to wrap it around 3 times, keeping it nice and tight, and I'm going to put that needle back through the first hole. Finally, I'm going to pull the remaining thread through, leaving myself a little knot on the surface. Through the back, wrap the needle, back through the hole. To create a stem stitch, I'm going to come up through the back of my fabric and create about a 1/4 inch stitch. Then, when I bring my needle back, I'm going to be directly beneath that first stitch, about halfway between the start and finish. And when I come back down, I'm going to be another 1/4 inch over. I'll keep repeating this process, stacking these threads together. And as I'm creating the stem stitch, I want to be aware that I'm not trying to split my thread when I'm coming back up. I'm supposed to be directly beneath it, and then I can continue on and move my stitch over. To make a chain stitch, I'm going to start by coming through the bottom of my fabric, pulling my thread all the way tight, and then bringing my needle directly back down into that same hole that I just created. Once I pull my thread through, I'm going to leave myself a little loop on the surface of the fabric. With this loop, I'm going to come back through the bottom of my fabric, run my needle through the middle, and pull it tight. From here, I'm going to restart those steps, going back into that first hole, pulling it tight to leave myself a little loop, and from here, I'm going to bring that needle back again, run it through the middle, and continue with that pattern. When I have my final chain, I'm going to tack it down just by bringing my needle to the opposite side of the chain and pulling it all the way down and tight. To create a satin stitch, I'm essentially going to be using a series of running stitches placed directly next to each other so that I can cover a large area. This is the stitch that we're going to be using for our patches the most, so this is a good one to practice. We're going to just be bringing our needle back and forth from point to point on our shape. So I'm starting at the bottom of my circle, moving through the top, and I'm just placing a series of single running stitches next to each other. To create a feather stitch, I'm going to start by coming through the back of my fabric and creating an initial stitch about 1/4 inch to one side. I'll leave myself a little bit of extra thread on the surface, and when I come back up with my needle, I'm going to be bringing it up directly between those 2 points and a little bit lower. And I'll be pulling that thread down as I bring it tight. I'm going to repeat this process again, bringing that stitch to the side, leaving some on the surface, and then coming up between and below to tack it down. This is really good for creating textures such as scales or feathers, and it's just a really fun stitch to know. And I'm going to finish it just how I did a chain, bringing it to the opposite end and tacking it down. To create the split stitch, I'm going to start by coming through the back of my fabric, pulling my thread tight, and bringing over a stitch about 1/4 inch. When I come back up with my needle, I'm going to be splitting that thread by coming directly beneath it, and then I'll move over another 1/4 inch to create my next stitch. Bringing my needle back up, I'm going to be splitting that thread again, moving over, and then repeating that process until I reach my desired length. To create a detached chain stitch, I'm going to start by coming up just like I did with my normal chain and bringing my needle right back down through that same hole. I'll leave myself a loop on the surface, so when I come back up with my needle, I will run it through that loop, pull it tight, come to the other side of the chain, and tack it back down. Again, I'm going to come through the bottom of my fabric, leave myself a loop on the surface, run my needle back through that loop, and then tack it down at the end. To create the fly stitch, I'm essentially making a detached feather stitch. So I'm going to start by creating a loose single stitch on the surface of my fabric. In between the start and end of that stitch, I'm going to choose a spot directly below it, bring my needle up, hooking on to that first stitch, and pulling it tight to tack it down. When I'm creating the fly stitch, I can have a variety of lengths between my stitch and the tack. To create a woven wheel, I'm going to start by creating a 5-pointed star out of straight stitches. Once I have my 5-pointed star, I'm going to bring my needle back up through the center of the star, and from here I'm going to run my needle under the first stitch, above the second, and then back below the third. I'm going to continue following this pattern all the way around so that I have a textured, lifted wheel. As I'm pulling my string through, I want to be aware of the amount of tension that I'm applying. As I get wider, I want to be pulling through with less force. To create a couching stitch, I'm going to start by creating a wide single stitch about 1 inch or so long, and then coming up below that stitch, I'm going to be tacking it in place with very small single stitches all the way along the original stitch. I can do this with straight lines, or I can leave myself a little bit more slack in my thread, and I can move it around and tack it in more organic shapes. To create a bullion knot, I'm going to start by coming through the back of my fabric, pulling my thread all the way tight, and creating one single stitch. I'm going to leave myself plenty of working thread here as I bring my needle back up through that first hole, and I am going to now lightly wrap my thread around my needle. Once I have it properly wrapped, I'm going to pinch that all together, keeping it in one spot as I pull the needle through, tightening the stitch all together. You may need to use your fingers or needle to help push all those wraps back into the center. And then once you're finished, you'll bring your needle to the end of the stitch and pull it through. Once again, I'm gonna pull through, bring my needle back through that first hole, and wrap around. To attach buttons, I'm going to start by placing my button on the surface of my fabric and bringing my needle up from behind through one of the holes. Here I'm just doing a simple cross stitch where I'm going corner to corner, creating a functional button attachment. I can also create decorative button attachments where I'm going to start the same way by tacking down my button through those middle 4 holes, but instead of sticking on the inside here, I'm going to start to wrap my stitches from that inner hole out to the outside edge of my button. And here I'm just doing a basic little crossing pattern, top and bottom. While this button is no longer functional for our purposes, it is a fun little decorative stitch to practice.